Let's look at another species here. Remember, we are in chapter 7 and it is called the Pica and cephalopod. We looked at the impact on humans, on different species, on plants, and now we're continuing with some more species that are being affected by climate change. And when we say climate change, remember, we are doing many things. Sometimes it is referred to as environmental change or global change, and the point is we are not just increasing greenhouse gases and making it warmer and humider and drier somewhere, wetter somewhere, and stormier somewhere, and sea level rise and all those things. We are also cutting trees, deforesting, and we are producing some pollution in the water and the air, and we create acid rain, and we increase the acidification of the ocean water, or reduce the pH. If you know what the pH is, if you don't know, do not worry about it. So here is another story, The Last Golden Toad, and here is Martha Crump, an ecologist who, obviously she loves ecology, the animals and the toads and so on and so forth, and she is looking sad and looking at this golden toad and telling the golden toad, "You are the one and only," and the golden toad is looking shocked, saying, "Is she telling me something? Is this really something to worry about? What would it be like to stand face to face with the last dodo, the last mammoth, and the last T-Rex? They came and they disappeared, and maybe now in the lab we will grow another mammoth, but they happened in the past when climate change, meteorite strike, and so on did those things. But now we are doing climate change, as we have talked about. We are forcing some species to adapt and relocate, and those who cannot do that simply have to die away, knowing that when it dies, the animal knowing that I have trouble reading, children. Do you have trouble reading sometimes? I do, because I didn't drink enough coffee this morning, maybe, right? Knowing that when it dies, that animal will never exist again, what would it be like? That's what Martha Crump is standing here and thinking about. When those creatures like the dodo and the T-Rex and the last mammoth died out, there were no people around. Martha was not around, her grandma was not around, her great-great-great-grandma was not around either. But when the golden toad became extinct, there was someone there to see it all happen. The amphibian expert Martha Crump had a front row seat to this sad event, and she hated what she saw. You know what amphibians are. They live in the water and they live on land, and you have many amphibian vehicles that they go in the water and that they come out and run on land, like James Bond and so on. The golden toad was a species of toad that was discovered in the mountains of Costa Rica in 1966. You know where Costa Rica is. It's in the western hemisphere, south of the United States, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, Caribbean Ocean. The creature lived there and now nowhere else. Well, the creature lived there and nowhere else, but there were plenty of them. Almost all year they hid deep in the cloud forests. When the rainy season came, they emerged to mate, and they made beautiful calls to call out for the girls to come and say, "Mate me for a date." Martha Crump saw this for herself on April 15, 1987, and the warming was just beginning to be recognized, and the UN was beginning to say, we need to do something. Many governments were beginning to say, we need to do something. Martha Crump struggled up the mountain to the territory of the golden toad. Among the twisting trees, in the mud around a few shallow ponds, there sat hundreds of bright orange males who were doing their best to woo the females. The party went on for a few days until the toads just disappeared back into the trees after their procreation was done, one by one, leaving thousands of eggs behind in the water. and the eggs would hatch and you would have more new baby toads, and this life cycle would continue. Martha stayed as well. She was fascinated. She's an ecologist. She loves to stay in the field and watch what's happening and document everything for us. She watched as the ponds dried up and the eggs shriveled. Somehow the toads knew what was going on too. They reappeared and started all over again in the season. Martha counted as many as 43,000 eggs in 10 different ponds. Just imagine the hard work Martha is doing for us, counting little, and they're not big eggs like a chicken egg, they are little eggs. So she has to sit there and count them, and maybe now we can use some machine to count them. But within a week the water had evaporated again. A year later Martha went back to the same place. After days of looking, she saw one lonely male sitting by the pond. She went on searching for weeks, but there was no sign of any other golden toads. A year later she went to look again, and again there was no sign of the happy frog gang of 1987. She did see one male sitting there though, in almost the same place as the previous year. Maybe it was even the same golden toad. In any case, it was the last one anyone has ever seen, and Martha was the one to see it disappear, the last one. That has got to be gut-wrenching, sad, depressing. If you're somebody who loves them and watches them and studies them and reports on them and understands how they work and what they are doing, what they are eating, when they are mating, and so on and so forth, you see it just disappear in front of your eyes. The golden toad made news as the first creature that was certain to have become extinct because of climate change. Global warming meant that there was less and less cloud in the cloud forests, and so the ponds dried out faster. The warm air took out whatever little water there was. The toads had vulnerable skin, which had always been protected by the cloud. Vulnerable, this is a word that means you are very susceptible, which means, let's say you are very young, your older brother may not always get sick, but you get sick every time you go to the daycare and come back because there's another kid being sick, and you keep catching bacteria and viruses and so on and so forth, because at a young age you are vulnerable and you are susceptible. So the golden toads are susceptible for sunlight, so they always had been protected by the cloud. But now that the dry weather was lasting longer and longer, the cloud no longer reached the forest. There were no golden toads left. Few years later, it was no longer such a certainty that their extinction was the fault of global warming. Okay, now the story gets complicated. Scientists came up with other explanations. Maybe El Niño played a role. We don't know what El Niño is, but there are podcasts of mine on my channel. If you're older, you can follow up, or you can look up on NOAA, NASA, National Geographic, and everybody has more information on El Niño. We mentioned it before. We said El Niño means the child, the Christ child, because warm waters appeared off the coast of Chile and South America in the winter. And that El Niño, we saw that it moves around the water back and forth and moves the rain around, and when it comes it moves the rain, so that maybe some years there is much less in Costa Rica, the jungles where the golden toads were waiting for the clouds and the rain. Maybe it was some kind of a disease that came along, because warm temperatures always increase the diseases, the mosquitoes, the ticks and so on we talked about. Maybe it was some kind of a fungus that grows in the jungle and can cause diseases. But then again, maybe all those causes actually had something to do with the climate change itself. Do you understand how complicated this is? Climate change doesn't just change one thing, it changes everything. So you have to be careful. The point is, climate change is hardly ever the only cause of extinction. If you are old and the heat wave comes, you may die. If the heat wave didn't come, you may have lived longer, and the heat wave may have come because of climate change. You see how things are connected? So no matter how loud the newspapers might shout about it, that El Nino caused it or fungus caused it, it may be related to the climate change in some indirect way. Anyway, in 2016, the newspapers also shouted that the first mammal had died out because of climate change. They were talking about the bramble K mosaic-tailed rat. Here is a bramble K mosaic-tailed uh, rat sitting in a little island and looking at the boat coming along and saying, "This is the end of my story, folks." They were talking about the bramble K mosaic-tailed rat. Everyone's heard of them, right? There were a few hundred living on an island the size of 6 soccer fields, so they were crowded on a little island. The rising salt water meant that fewer plants were growing there and there was less to eat. Storms were making the island crumble away around them. Using cameras and their own eyes, scientists searched the entire island, but no more rats were ever found. The bramble K mosaic-tailed rat had disappeared. To be fair though, if all of you go sit on a small island or in a forest on a mountain in Costa Rica, you are asking for trouble anyways. If something goes wrong, your species is gone over kaput. So it's not surprising that these animals died out. It'll take a while with the polar bears, the elephants, and the sea turtles, but those animals are threatened too. And as you know, if one species dies or goes into a decline, it has consequences for the other species as well, because it is one big ecosystem where everybody is playing some role in the ecosystem service, and if one service stops, then everything else can go haywire or perturb everything else. Well, unfortunately we have to read a few more of these impact stories, and we'll come back and talk about something up from the south, and you are looking at the ants and the spiders. So insects, which are a very large number of species on the planet, of course are facing issues. There are ants living in the desert, but so they are used to dry, hot weather, but if it gets hotter, doesn't get rain once in a while, then they are in trouble as well. Okay, so we'll come back and read a bit more, again remembering not to get anxious, not to get depressed, but just learn, and then keep thinking what you want to do. I paused it there for some reason. Anyway, see you in the next podcast.